Thank you. It's a great honor to be back here in one of my alma maters. A very important time in my life. And so after having studied here, I went abroad to Holland, and it was actually when I returned to Canada and started my studies in the BAM Center that I discovered Szymanowski, being introduced to him via some violin pieces actually my mom had thrown at me and wanted to tackle. And so we started playing the myths, which I suggest as mainstream repertoire for all violin and piano duos. It's really fantastic. So anyway, after that led to discovering much more Szymanowski, and I decided to write a dissertation for my doctoral degree on the METOPES. And so today I'm presenting a lecture on the exoticism and intercultural influences in the piano cycle METOPES, written in 1915 by the Polish composer Karol Szymanowski. Karol Szymanowski is a little bit left in the shadows in the 20th century milieu, although he is generally represented as the greatest composer in Poland after Chopin. He's born around the same time as Stravinsky and Bartók, actually the same year as Stravinsky, but 1 year previous to Bartók. So he's smack in that generation of great composers of the 20th century, and he's in the sidelines a little bit, so it's good to discover something new about this interesting composer. So this presentation will go through a few steps. I'm going to talk a little bit about his life, his musical developments, his youth periods, how he moved around Europe, integrating different types of cultural influences and exotic influences, and all this comes together in the composition of his piano cycle, the METOPES, which I will then perform. There's 3 of them. I'll perform them each, and in between I will analyze them a little bit as well. And then we can just wrap it up and have an open stage if there's any questions. So like many of the composers of this period in Europe before the First World War, there was so much going on. It's a very rich cultural time, much intercultural development already, and composers were generally faced and bombarded with so much different information from different types of, not only the technology was linking countries together, but so much new exotic ideas were coming from afar, from the Orient and from Africa, etc. So composers were generally shifting quite frequently, and this is the case with Szymanowski especially. He was really much like a sponge and absorbing things and trying different sort of styles. He's also been criticized for this very type of this way of being, but in a matter of fact, it's actually not only this facet which is distinctive. There's something also very structurally inherent from his very first works, which identifies him as a unique composer in his own right. So he started off as following in the footsteps of the great Romantic composers. Of course, he can't leave Chopin behind. It's his heritage. So he was going through formulating after Chopin's works, and of course Scriabin comes in the picture as a very important follower of Chopin as well, and the late German Romantics. And Scriabin continues to affect Szymanowski as he goes into his second stage, in which he admits the Impressionists and Stravinsky, and as well as exotic influences in Africa and Asia. And all this comes together to form his style, which he so interestingly projects in the METOPES, among other works in that period. And this final period is a folkloristic return to his roots, and this kind of plays out along the same time as Poland developing itself as a nation state after the war. So he's celebrating that and using more folkloristic ideas and returning to traditional sources. Okay, so if we go into his early life quickly, it's kind of not really well known that he's not actually from Poland per se. At that time when he was growing up and during his birth, he was actually born in the Ukraine, deep inside, past Kiev, even close to the Black Caspian Sea. So, and this is because at one point Poland was a big empire in its heyday, of course, and Germany was still little fiefdoms, and Russia is trying to put its big empire together. And so it stretched quite far to the eastern frontier, and a lot of estates were dotting the countryside down there. And so he belonged to a nobility, and his ancestors served for the princes, for the kings, royalty. And so they were stationed way down on the furthest frontiers, kind of like the Wild West up here, I would think, back in the day. So it's also interesting to note that so he has this Russian side to him. Obviously he spoke Russian, he spoke Ukrainian. In his household, it was a very patriotic Polish culture going on there. His father, very patriotic. And but they had friends that were mingling around, like one in particular, the Neuhauses, which is very important because his good friends from childhood, Heinrich Neuhaus, would go on to become one of the great pedagogues of the 20th century, teaching Gilels and Richter at the Moscow Conservatoire. So it's a very important connection, and Neuhaus would actually premiere a lot of his early works. And so they studied together at Gustav Neuhaus's school, which is the father of little Heinrich. And it's safe to say that Gustav is Szymanowski's real mentor, first real mentor, and probably one of the most important in the fact that he not only taught him how to play piano, but also encouraged his compositional aspirations, and they went through, obviously, literature, French and German and Nietzsche and all sorts of things. So also at this time he was exposed to Wagner. He had scores of Wagner's operas as a teenager, and his other cousins, Blumenfelds, they were friends of Scriabin, so they would bring new scores from Scriabin's latest etudes. So it was a very fascinating little household he had going. Also very many connections to Tchaikovsky, which is on a neighboring estate. So there was all sorts of little interconnections going on even around him at this early age. So at that point his style was still in development, and some of his earlier pieces were being already composed at this point, preludes, etudes. There's a little map I just wanted to show you. There's a Kiev there in present-day Ukraine, and Kiev is over here when Poland was a reasonable size at that point, 1764. And then Tymoshuvka is somewhere down in the furthest point, so it's kind of close to Kiev. On this map, it would be somewhere here. So you get an idea of the geography of this. So he went to Warsaw to undertake formal education. Warsaw at this point under Russian jurisdiction, but nevertheless already becoming a little bit more culturally active as a Polish center, thriving ahead of Krakow and Lwów, which had kind of been more important in the earlier years of the 20th century, because Warsaw, having been a center of revolution, always under pressure and suffering consequences. But at this point, again, when he arrived, it just started to flourish again. The Russians, they kind of backed off and allowed a lot of things to start happening. The Warsaw Philharmonic really took a great propel forward and established itself as one of the great orchestras up to that point in Poland. And so he was exposed to a lot of visiting artists coming through. Of course, Paderewski being one of the most notably important, and he would take a fascination in certain pieces of Szymanowski's earlier work. He didn't stray too far into impressionistic music, but he did perform. He was an important propagator of early works of Szymanowski. And here we can see the opera house in Warsaw during Szymanowski's time and during Chopin's time. So I guess after years of revolution, they rebuilt it again, and it was in full force when Szymanowski was coming to Warsaw at that time. Important for his development, more so than his formal studies, was his discovery of Richard Strauss, who came there to conduct and lecture the orchestra. And so I think he was really fascinated by these sessions, and it's safe to say that he developed a really great admiration for Strauss at this point, and this would continue to last for over a decade after this point. So this began a really long love affair with Strauss in a certain sense, and also sort of a way of dealing with Romanticism in its epic forms. which Szymanowski really jumped into and started to make his own in certain extended classical genres like sonatas and variations and fugues. Okay, so here we have this group of composers which banded together. They're called Young Poland, and I'm just going to read a little excerpt from the great Polish composer of the second half of the century, which we know, Witold Lutosławski. He went on to say this about these young artists here. Then the wall separating our music from current European influences was suddenly broken down as though through a battering ram, when a group of talented, young, ambitious musicians, generally known as Young Poland, appeared on the scene. Despite the noticeable influences of Wagner, Strauss, and Reger, the individual styles of these young composers were clearly taking shape. So there's Lutosławski acknowledging this big breakthrough in the Polish musical scene, which Szymanowski was really a critical factor. So maybe more important than that was also his associations with three other great ambassadors of the Polish musical world: the pianist Arthur Rubinstein, the violinist Paweł Kochański, and the conductor Grzegorz Fittelberg. So all three of them on their respective instruments. Of course, Rubinstein, the great pianist, he would take over the role of Heinrich Neuhaus and in later years premiere a lot of Szymanowski's compositions around the world. And the same goes for Kochański on the violin and Fittelberg as a conductor. So they really did a lot for new Polish music around the globe. So young Poland, they kind of were based in Berlin. So this is the beginning of Szymanowski's voyages, moving him to Berlin. And he also discovered a lot of success in Vienna, following some performances there. So he developed a fascination with the German culture quite intensely. And he went to Vienna to live eventually at that point for a little while. So before I get into Vienna, I just want to briefly pick up on exoticism because it's coming into the picture now. The definition that I chose here, it's exoticism refers to the interest in everything which does not belong to our Occidental civilization and which is brought away from faraway lands or ancient times. So it's quite a broad category, and admittedly, it's too hard to pinpoint what is exotic, what is not, because I mentioned everything under the sun pretty much, which could participate in that definition, such as Orientalism, mythology, Greek antiquity, and folklore. And of course, each composer would pick and choose from their particular fascination with what they wanted to display through the relationship with their exotic inspirations. The same would go for Szymanowski. But two particular events which brought these exotic tendencies to Europe come through the world exhibitions. And the first one, mostly in the world of fine arts, is in the Vienna exhibition of 1873. And Japanese woodcuts were a very important import into this exposition. And suddenly there was like a new relationship with perspective and color. And this was a really big impact on fine arts, and of course led to the big turnaround in modernism in European visual arts, and all big names such as Monet or Van Gogh or Klimt or Toulouse-Lautrec, the list goes on and on. They were really into something massive and the change from a classical perspective on art. And for music, this was particularly important for the Paris World Exhibition, hot on the heels in 1889, when a lot of different cultures would come from around the world as well and perform in their little performances of ensembles with strange instruments, interesting new approach to tonality. One particular group, I guess we all know this, the gamelan music, which affected Debussy. And there's much more than just that, but that was a really important trigger, and obviously Debussy was the father of this movement, taking it to the musical world through his compositions. Okay, so we return to Vienna, and just before Szymanowski arrived there, they had finished building the Ringstrasse, which is the big architectural monuments around Vienna, and as we can see, the parliament is built in a return to a sort of Greek style, and I mean, that's not a surprise. The White House is like that too. But there's something that's very fascinating about Greek antiquity, and it's always returning. And I guess it's the origins of our Western civilization, so it's somehow remains a tendency to follow. And we have also a little statue here, and this is the symbol that the Viennese or the Habsburg Empire had chosen to represent their empire, and that was Athena, the goddess of wisdom, the goddess of war. But they considered this a much more somehow a liberal symbol, in a way that it's not too disruptive to society, as let's say in France how they chose liberty, and it's a little bit too socialist, or I don't know, revolutionary for the Habsburgs. And so there's a little bit of an opening there for artists. And in a series of paintings, the Austrian painter Gustav Klimt went through a process of distorting the ancient iconography of Athena in this case in a truly subversive way. So myths and symbols drawn from primitive Greece proved a powerful means for laying bare the instinctual life that had been sublimated or repressed in the classical tradition. So he's the first to really delve into that through the fine arts, incorporating the antiquity and putting a little bit of his own personal spin on it. And in Vienna at that time, there's all sorts of things that are exotic and referring to Greek antiquity, which come into the scene. I mean, they're also around Europe, but they're in Vienna, and Szymanowski is there at the time, so he's exposed to these things. And Strauss reaches his pinnacle in his operas Salome and Electra. This association of sexuality and death, fascinating all of Europe, you know, and the shuddering public was gripped in the spectacle of Clytemnestra's bloodlust in Strauss's Electra. And this is very interesting too, because Strauss approached the atonal and neuropsychological world of Schoenberg and Berg. So he's really delving deep into other avenues which were prevalent in Vienna. So also Debussy's operas performed in Vienna, really important moment, bringing in the impressionistic wave. And of importance too is the translations of various Asian poets and Arabian poets by Hans Betke. And Szymanowski discovered one of these one of these translations of a Persian poet, Hafiz. And this is important because in Hafiz he creates the song with singing, and it's a lieder, love songs of Hafiz. And it starts to use not only exoticism in its, you know, narrative underlining, which is okay, but already in the actual fabric of the composition, it starts to take its place as well. So going away from tonality and using more different types of compositional techniques was a very important moment. And lo and behold, Stravinsky's Petrushka, which is perhaps the biggest breakthrough in Europe at that time. Well, maybe Rite of Spring after that as well, but for Szymanowski this was definitely a big moment. And again, Lutosławski had an interesting quote, and he said that discovering Stravinsky, it's like being faced with a big mountain that everyone has to cross. So at one point, every composer is faced with the important genius of this Russian composer. So very impressionistic, very exotic, very folkloric, very primitive. Everything, it's starting to come out in this important work. And now returning a little bit back to Klimt, in addition to the influence of classical antiquity, Klimt drew on the exoticism of more remote cultures. So not only the Japanese woodcuts, which as you can see here already, perspective aspect has been modified based on his exposure to those, but he encountered also Byzantine mosaics in Italy, in Ravenna. And you can see the Byzantine spirals and the use of gold dust and all this acquiring an exotic luxuriance, biological and ornamental eloquence. So Szymanowski's own exoticism begins to take place now when he goes on his voyages into the Mediterranean, into the lands of Sicily. And what he discovers there is really the final trigger for him, because Sicily has a relish of beautiful architectural monuments because of the fact that in the 12th century there was a king by the name of King Roger who came from the Normans from the north, conquered Sicily and established a court where he allowed all the people to freely express their culture. So there was Byzantine influence, Islamic, Greek, and of course the adolescent cultures from Northern Europe, and they all kind of came together, and they were allowed to create artwork in the name of Christ, because this was the new father figure, but nonetheless they were allowed to use their cultural traditions. So we have these factors coming into play. And here's a picture of the royal chapelle of the Norman kings of Sicily. So you can see the domed arches a little bit in Arabic style, and of course the heavy golden interlay and the Byzantine ornamentation. And of course everything there, it's biblical stories from the Bible, so it's really loaded narratively. And the arches also very Arabic. And on the outside of the cathedrals even, it's quite fascinating that they were decorating them, and to the point where you can even decipher Sufi script, which is Islamic writing, and it's embedded deep inside. Very interesting also because it's a Christian cathedral, and yet there's elements from different writing. There's the dome of the Martirana, and more presumptuous of King Roger to have a mosaic of himself being crowned Christ. So there's a lot of things going on. This is returning to the Greek antiquity, which we find in Sicily. A lot of archaeological sites, a lot of temples. And this is important to now directly to the metopes. Why? Because a metope is a fragment here of a sculpture, a frieze, which is built usually on the top of these columns, in between these triglyphs. And they usually fall down over the years, over the centuries, but some of them are preserved in museums. And so here's a picture of one from the museum in Roman Anatolia, Istanbul. A marble, beautiful one. Another one here from Museum of Palermo. So maybe Szymanowski saw similar types of metopes when he was there. Thank you. So all these things come together finally, and we get to a moment of sort of back off from all this profusion of detail and inspiration to create now in his work something very beautiful. Because during the First World War, Szymanowski, he caught the last train back to deep within the Ukraine, back to his estates, closed himself off, and over those 4 years he created a huge opus of genres, violin works, piano works, orchestral works, and it's really remarkable compositions, and one of them, of course, being the metopes. So here he's entering into a more personal sound world, and we can safely say that this is in his second period of composition. So if we go to the metopes now, they're united by the theme of Odysseus and Homer's Odyssey. They're actually based on Homer's Odyssey. So they use three narratives from the Odyssey to form the three piano pieces for the piano, the metopes. The first one, the Wyspa Syren in Polish, Sirens Island in English, L'Île des Sirènes in French. A musical vision of sirens, their fatal singing bringing death upon seamen. The second piece, Calypso, invokes the story of the eponymous nymph from the island of Ogygia, who kept Odysseus prisoner for 7 years. And the third one, Nausicaa, eulogizes Odysseus' unhappy, unrequited love for the daughter of the king of the Phaeacians. So the first of these pieces, L'Île des Sirènes, takes much of its musical detail from the mythological source, not only in the more and more insistent lullaby theme, which runs through the music, but in configurations which presumably reflect the double flute and lyre associated in Homer with the sirens. So we have a recollection of bird song, as well as mythological harp-like strumming, reproductions on the piano. Also, you have to kind of imagine that they are kind of like harpies in the mythological sense. So they're not exactly women, they're half birds, and they're sort of creatures which are trying to seduce Odysseus. And this style, it's very much bordering on a different type of sonority which we already start to hear only in Messiaen, so it's quite futuristic. So here's a picture of a siren, and she's serenading Odysseus as on a Greek vase, and he's tied to the mast. So the story of this excerpt from the Odyssey goes as follows. Odysseus was warned of the enchanting voices of the sirens by Circe, who gave him the following advice. Plug your men's ears with beeswax, and if you are eager to hear the sirens' music, have your crew bind you hand and foot to the mast, and make them swear not to let you escape, however harshly you may threaten them. As the ship approached Siren land, Odysseus took Circe's advice, and the sirens sang so sweetly, promising him foreknowledge of all future happenings on earth, that he shouted to his companions, threatening them with death if they would not release him. But obeying his earlier orders, they only lashed him tighter to the mast. Thus, the ship sailed by in safety, and the sirens committed suicide for vexation. Here's a representation of the Ulysses and the Sirens by the pre-Raphaelite painter John William Waterhouse. You can get an idea of that scene. So here's a short summary of the piece. A short prelude sets the scene of magical expectancy amidst the play of waves with a sinuous arpeggiated right-hand figure followed by a bass theme and parallel ninths. When the sirens begin their seductive song over fantastic trills and arpeggios. A new scared sando triplet figure opens the development in which fragments from all musicals materials sweeps to a tempestuous cadenza, and a brief coda presents the vital motives in their original state. Get into a little bit of a analysis. So the piece opens off with the ninth already from the opening. Of course, the marking here, it's very liberal, lento, molto rubato e improvvisando. So that helps a lot, but it's always good to limit your adherence to such indications. Try to keep structure paramount, because that's all we really have going for us in these kind of pieces. So the opening ninth chord, it's the beginning of the foreshadowing of the use of ninths, often in parallel motion later on in the piece. And we have sort of a gentle undulations already from the beginning, replicating the gentle ebb and flow of the waves. And bitonal cadence to start off the piece. Oops. So bitonality here is also of the essence, as you may have noticed. But nonetheless, there is this fabric here, this line which comes out of the fabric, surrounded by all the opulent bitonality. And it's the most identifiable in this texture, and it's the bird call, so to speak, of the first motive, which will later return later on in the piece. And what we can see here is it uses the elemental device of the functional harmonic system, which is the leading tone, right? So we have a D going through a passing accented tone to the E flat. So that's our first guess as to what the tonality can be. E flat major. So we go on now, and we have a second section which appears, and these are when the ninths also take to the front with their movements. And around them we can see figurations, and these figurations outline a D dominant seventh. So it's this stuff on top, and also this chord here, and then the bass notes underneath the melody. So what this is, it's sort of a fusion of harmonic tonality in the Western style and the impressionistic movements of the whole tone scales. And it's important because the D dominant thing here will later become more and more leading tone-ish as well towards the E flat, so it's important. And then in the basses we have A flat and D, which are recurring already since the beginning. The first note is the A flat as well, and there's an A flat pedal. So if we look at long-term structure, he's using A flat and D flat quite repetitively until the appearance of this main theme, the sweet song of the Sirenes. So if I can just play a little bit of this passage, you can have an idea of that sound. So there's a D flat, A flat, and then it eventually resolves into the B flat chord, which leads to the E flat home key. So we can imagine the D and the A flat as being a part of the longer dominant, the third and the seventh from the dominant harmony, which eventually arrives to the cadence on E flat. But also, let's think back to how Scriabin and Debussy use long range tritone movements in many of their pieces too. So there's some connections there, like Prélude après-midi d'Infant and Sonatas of Scriabin. They tend to use these long-range bass sort of functionalities as a pivot, as a structural element. So in this little part here, we have the main principal theme of the Honey Sweet Lullaby, and it's just written out in a more or less standard harmonic harmonization. Going through like a secondary dominant, back to the dominant, back to the tonic. And this is also in very simple 2-bar phrases, so it's very clear pinpoint of a nice solid structure there. After this, we have Szymanowski going off into sort of transitional movements which link up to another return of this theme, this time in a more elaborate display with ornamentation and octaves, embellishments. So I don't have it there, but it's also the same sort of thing. And after the first climax, we arrive to a little theme here. A little motive, I should say. It's not really too thematic, although it only comes back a few times also at the end. And so this is, let's say, the beginning of a sort of development section, which brings in alternations of the bird song. And then a little rhythmic ideas coming in between, finally leading to a più mosso section here. And there we have a little bit more developmental activity with the bringing in the ninths. And the bird song is now hidden in a middle ground texture. Sometimes he uses 3 staves, which lets him show the melody in the middle with ornamentation above and below. And so here the ninths are pitched up against the lullaby. And then as he moves on and it gets a bit more active, at one point there's a bar, for example this bar here, which uses all 12 tones of the chromatic scale. And I think for the next few measures the same thing happens. So he's already kind of pushing his limits of tonality as far as he can without adopting Schoenberg's dodecaphonic system. So it's really interesting how he's trying to create an impressionistic sound with 12 notes in the bar and not to rely on the dodecaphonic methods. So it's not diametric at all, it's purely intuitive sound world, and yet it allows him to create impressionistic sort of sound. So that's a interesting little part of the piece. Then after going to a big climax, it also eventually lands on the D. So it's one of the main pillars with A flat. And from that he builds a cadenza. And this is the first of his cadential moments, which reappear in the other metopes as well, where he tries to bring together white and black notes. So it's nothing new in the sense that it's been done by Debussy, Bruyard, and Ravel, Judot, and Stravinsky, Petrushka, chord, whatever. Except the fact is here he's trying to make it very personal, make it a unique sort of wash. And I think he comes close to achieving something special with these rondels. disappears into a trill. And then this trill is the basis for return of the harp-like bird calls. And then it sort of goes down the instrument. And it continues traveling down until it finally brings in a sort of a restatement of all the thematic material in a sort of a modified sonata form, I would say. So he's using also clever ways from his training as a romantic composer to somehow fuse together all his impressionistic ideas. So I think structure here, it's really important in these pieces in order for them to be coherent, because otherwise it's very, very difficult to pick things out from this. And also it's very frustrating to analyze for that very reason, because it's so bitonal that you somehow don't know where's direction. So I like to group certain sections that are transitory as color zones or constellations, things that are a bit more abstract, yes, but they are only in transition, have a transitional function, so they don't derange too much from the return of the thematic material, which follows in sort of singing lines throughout the piece. Okay, so we can go now to the next metope. The second metope here, it's entitled Calypso, after the goddess of Ogygia, and Odysseus was marooned there for 7 years. And Calypso offered Odysseus ageless youth, but he wanted life, not heroic immortality. So he was frustrated after being there so long, and of course he was being awaited by his wife Penelope, so he decided he wanted to go back to her at some point. And she wouldn't want to let him go so easily, but after Athena counsels Zeus to release Odysseus from Calypso, Hermes was sent as a messenger, and she agrees that he can set sail for his homeland. And in the Odyssey, we have this written out in a very, very expressive language. So it's profusely impressionistic, acting on the sensations, and all these words like great fire, fragrance, cedar, juniper, loom, luxuriant wood, alder, golden shuttle, sweet-smelling cypress, falcons. It was just a very, very stimulating environment for this type of situation. And here is Calypso and Odysseus, painted by Jan Bruegel, the elder. And he's a Flemish painter, and he traveled to Italy and fascinated with color and radiance. And so his Calypso is a magical, sensuous, hedonistic world of fantasy. His Odysseus is still eager to please his mistress. However, in this representation of Calypso by Arnold Böcklin, we have a very contrasting image, a bare and desolate landscape of solitude and futility. And one of his other paintings, Isle of the Dead, was the inspiration for Rachmaninoff's famous symphonic tone poem by the same name. So in this particular piece, it's a mosaic again of little motivic elements, not very long, usually not lasting more than a few measures at a time. So there's like 3 notable ones which are prevalent throughout the piece. And they're always interrupted by transitions and sudden rhythmic ideas. So they form a sort of kaleidoscope, a myriad of short phrases. They attempt to grow, but then they get cut off, interrupted by other themes. They're like brief fireflies living in their moments of color and painting in the picture. But there is an interesting form to this piece, and I'll get into it as well. So the Calypso opens with a deep, lugubrious roll on a D in the bass, seeming to symbolize the depths of the ocean, followed by a flash of sparkling sound. It's a kind of Polish scarbo, like a scarbo from Ravel, which seems to return all the time, the sort of flickering passage-like material. So amidst the polytonal harmonic resonance, there's a motive in the middle ground texture. This can be we can interpret this as the call of Calypso for Odysseus, right there. And it happens a few times, one's going down. And after that, what follows is another one of those empirical passages, the white and black note combinations between the two hands, this time descending in a flurry, bobbing down the keyboard. And it brings in the principal motive. As we can see, the principal motives, they tend to come in a little bit later in general. But so this is the Berceuse, a nice 6/8 rocking meter. I'm not getting my triplets. Hold on. And so this is a bitonal fusion of D minor, G sharp minor, G sharp major. Sorry. Well, actually, there's a B on top, so it's major minor. And that's another interesting thing here. He likes to do that. He's always shifting. The major minor functionality is always going all over the place. And we can see that here too with the E sharp going to the F sharp. So there's already a change from minor to major at the first moment there. And what happens after this, there's some transitional moments which lead to a series of themes, and they're linked together by these tatters of little rhythmic points. And so the second stage of intensity in Calypso is probably at this point, and it arrives to this theme here. Scriabinesque, as I mentioned. He's also using the A flat D pivot points as he had used in the Île des Sirenes, so that's also interesting that he brings them back here to support this secondary thematic zone. And the third important motive is reminiscent of Straussian decadence, and it's also very easily harmonizable. Drops down to C on the bass. And there's a transition, and this transition ushers in the development here. And the development is now over the top of the A. The Berceuse theme over top of an A pedal point, with the B sharp going to C sharp in the bass. It's quite richly bitonal there throughout, and the bass points go down to G flat, bringing in that flat. It's a little bit of a bucket of sound there. Sometimes it's hard to, you have to really pinpoint the bass to make sure you get the extremes isolated from that harmonic opulence. And then, after that final flash, he brings in the the flurry of which leads into this final arrival of the Berceuse theme, which is a sort of recapitulation. If I take it from there. And so he's going into the F sharp with more intensity here. The E sharp there, going to the F sharp there, and then it keeps moving. And then he even brings in the subdominant here. With the B flat going to the B natural. So he's really moving this theme a little bit more than usual. Beautiful little arpeggiation which funnels in a magical transition, restatement of the other thematic zone, which also gives him this sort of a modified sonata structure after he brings in again the Straussian theme and linking it through a circle of fifths. And the piece ends really beautiful with a really open keyboard. So the sound is really marvelous as it unlocks in the final measures there. It's on an A major chord, which is very interesting. I don't have it there. So finally the A takes over from the D pedal points. Okay, so now we can get into the third and final piece in the cycle, which is quite short compared to the other two. A little bit more active, though, in many ways. So first I'll tell the story. So Odysseus was shipwrecked, and his little boat crashed on the coast of Phaeacia. And he woke from deep sleep to see Nausicaa, the daughter of the Phaeacian king, leading her handmaidens in a spirited dance. Unlike the Sirens and Calypso, Nausicaa's intentions in Ulysses' regard, Ulysses being Odysseus here, the same thing, entirely honorable, and therefore her bitonality is euphonious and innocent sounding. So after clothing him and taking him to see her father at the palace, Nausicaa fell in love with Odysseus, but that love remained unrequited as Odysseus dreamed of a speedy return home. In contrast to the brooding sensual tapestry of Calypso, the final Metope is all air and light and dancing motion. It is the most dynamic, cheerful, and resonating with vital energy. Here we have a representation of Odysseus and Nausicaa by Peter Paul Rubens. Perhaps a moment of terror when they see Odysseus naked on the beach there with all her handmaidens. And this is a little bit more noble. Already he's clothed and it's a procession going to see the king, painting by Charles Glare. So the dancing Nausicaa, one of Odysseus' most poignant figures, is more simply represented than Calypso or the Sirens. After her opening measures, sometimes gracious, sometimes gay, more energetic figures produce a dazzling, accelerated climax, which launches a characteristic bitonal cadenza. The piece closes suddenly with the dance theme in decline. Okay, so this theme here, at the very beginning we have already the presentation of Nausicaa's theme. And we have the same harmonies like in Calypso, G sharp minor and D major, but here we don't feel them as being heavy and brooding. It's much more, it's a transformation suddenly, the same two fusions in a different sort of arrangement, and we have a totally different atmospheric sound world. So the bitonal rhythm is fused on the F sharp, and it's a sort of Siciliana, which is the rhythmical idea which carries the piece forward. This rhythm would also be taken to its apex in tambourine and zither of the Bacchic dances in his opera King Roger. So the melody, when it enters, is based on perfect fourths, and it's very simple fourth relationships. And then there's a little theme that comes in briefly, alternating, responding to the first motive with that second motive, a little playful scherzando over a D pedal, and then after a modulation it comes back over an E pedal, and then after going through a further static sort of section, the only really static section in the piece, we come to another lively section which leads into this part here, which I'm going to get in from earlier moment. And this is a little dancing sort of thematic zone which will take prevalence in the cadenza because of these fifths jumping with the thumb higher up, and that'll be the material which he uses for the cadenza later on. And another interesting point here, this little black note, white note flourish, really beautiful. Really heavy interlay here. He's multi-storying resonances, registers, going up and down the piano. Really unusual resonance, actually. And all this is intuitively composed and not dodecaphonic as Schoenberg would have had it. So at one point then it goes up to apex, and we have sort of these figurations. And these are reminiscent of the lyre-like configurations from the first piece, from the L'Île des Sirenes. And they're undulating, suspended, and they gather momentum and they start zigzagging down the length of the keyboard, preparing for a big bang. But very gorgeous. So they go down the keyboard, and as they go back up, they arrive to a cadenza. Sorry, not a cadenza, but a new allargando motive, sorry. Allegramento. And there's a halo of clusters on the top, a little bit of clustered activity in the bottom, and then in the third stave again, we have the theme. And it happens again, this time with the triplets in the bass and the bottom texture. And that takes us into another little motive here, which is in the second stave of this example. A little bit more folkloric this time, in a sense sort of anticipating his move to folkloric genre in the future. And then it cuts out it gives way to this written out cadenza here. A sort of undulation, which I mentioned the fifths and the thumb on the. So the melody could be in the thumb here, and the top part is stretching a distance of ninths. So again, we have the ninths coming into action, and so they go in contrary motion between the two hands, and then they go up to the summit. And again, once they arrive up there. Let's see if I can remember that previous chord there. That's it. Then it arrives to this. And again, this is the final representation of the black and white notes, this time in its final moment of fury, cascading all the way down from the topmost parts, finally changing into octaves. From Calypso, as you can clearly hear there. So this is actually the climax of this little piece. And for a moment, we can imagine that Ulysses is in Nausicaa's power and he's recollecting Calypso in that moment. And so it quickly backs off after that, and we have all the themes sort of overlay, Nausicaa's delicate theme and overlay. And so they're fused there for a second, and a final little ascent. Oh, I should have put it up there. Here, let's just go through that. Dies away with little tails of Nausicaa's theme. Very beautiful bitonality. Disappearing into the distance, and the piece finishes with two dabs of D major chords, articulating secco against the suspended G sharp minor chord to finish the cycle. So in conclusion, based on what we have heard here today, I would freely say this is a sort of an attempt to bring together two of the main currents of this profuse time before the World War, represented on one hand by Debussy, on the other hand by Schoenberg, and they attempt to seek a resolution in Szymanowski's Metopes. There's a very heavy saturation of harmonic complexity, and I think at this point Szymanowski backs down from trying to go further on in this direction. His other big works, the Masques, which were written after the Metopes, they are not as heavy in their chromaticism as the Metopes already. So I guess this was his first attempt at doing something really out of line with the norm, and he backed off after this. But in general, though, they do represent an idea that has been fulfilled, and they are part of his inspirational route, which took him through all of Europe, from Austro-Germany, Italy, a little bit of Africa and Asia, home to Poland, where he attempted to create these works. A journey which brought together all his love for vital different cultures and the synthesis of mythological diversity. So yeah, in this inner landscape, he tapped into a primordial source of inspiration in trying to get in touch with a futuristic sound world, and I think he kind of went quite far out, pushing the boundaries of tonality and still trying to remain truthful to his roots as a Western composer. So this is a part of my doctoral dissertation, which I finished a few years ago. And there's Szymanowski hanging out the window there in his little village in southern Poland mountains. So thank you very much for partaking in this lecture today. I forgot to leave the stage open, so if anybody wants to jump in with some comments or some questions, maybe I can help to answer. Feel free, now's the time. Yes?
The myths are after this?
The myths, actually, they're written at the very same time, as a matter of fact. But I think if you want to be really specific, he may have written one metope or something, and then he wrote a myth. But I think they were quite analogous to one another in their chronology. So yes, they are quite close, very, very close. And already we see that in the myths that it's not so demanding in terms of the oral intensity of this sort of chromaticism. It's a bit more tame to allow the violin to sing through, maybe, perhaps.
And did he intend to orchestrate these things, to put for orchestra?
He intended to orchestrate the masks. I don't know if you guys know this, but the piece, the triptych, which comes just after Metopes. But I never had a chance to. I think maybe, perhaps Spiegelberg may have done a little bit of one of the masks at one point, but he never did, and that's something that still probably could be a successful thing to try to do, to utilize the orchestral soundscape. Yeah. Sure.
Excuse me, what were the masks exactly, methods exactly?
What were the metopes?
Yeah, methods. The original. I mean.
You mean how they came to be? Yeah, they're the things on top of the sculptures.
Yeah,
They're the frieze. I guess it's called a frieze in the triglyph, and that falls down. It is a sort of a print, though. It's an imprint, from what I understand, and so it makes you also find the closest parallel would be Debussy's Estampes, because they're also prints based on prints. So I think it's a very parallel sort of attack at something which is in a similar vein. One based on paper prints and another based on sculpture prints.
How were these works received?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, they were premiered in like the interwar years. They were dedicated to one guy who premiered them, Sasha Dubyansky, in Petersburg and Moscow. At the same time when Prokofiev premiered some of his stuff, and they were together in that time with mutually having their works performed at a similar venue. But I mean, this was interwar stuff. I don't know if many people came. But I also know that Rubinstein premiered the Metopes in New York at some concert esthétique or some French event or something, but I don't know how they were received there, but it was probably a smaller sort of a premiere shortly after. I know that Rubinstein, he liked to play the masks a lot, and that was more his thing because they're a bit more flashy and not so complicated, and very easy for the audience to ride along with in a more traditional sense. So yeah, it's a good question. I think these pieces are a little bit more sidelined by the other two, the myths and the masks. Definitely, they're not as mainstream by far. Yeah.
So his works are available on CD, perhaps, by.
Oh yeah, for sure. There's a lot of Szymanowski music out there.
And is yours? Do you have any renditions?
I'm actually in the process of having Szymanowski CD released, but I'm still working on it. I'm in the middle of it actually, so definitely I'll have Metopes and.
Within the year?
Pardon me? Yeah.
Within the year?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I'm going to do some of his earlier works, which are easier to get the romantic idea across. His variations, really successful pieces. Sometimes they're really chameleon-like, because one variation is Frank, and the other one is Tchaikovsky, another one is Rachmaninoff, another one is Scriabin. But at the same time, you have some things from Nausicaa in between all the time. So it's interesting how he's like going through all the sort of influences in his early works. And then in these works, even then, you can always hear some echoes of Scriabin or Schoenberg or. Pardon me?
I heard a lot of Berg in it.
Really? Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, definitely.
It's got a lighter texture than Berg, but the
Yeah.
chord sounds are.
Yeah. Okay, I would like to take more interest in that for sure. Like his sonata, right? The first sonata.
Yes, like there are things like.
Yeah.
I really like this song.
Actually, I think he even based some themes from his first sonata on Berg's sonata, I remember reading. So he even extracted one of Berg's themes and also did something. So he's really just all over the map, I think, in one of those composers that is changing masks quite a lot. But hopefully, and I think safe to say, definitely there's always, in that itself, he manages to become what he is through this sort of transmutation of other styles. So, anything else?
The only other thing I would love to say is what I think of that must have been to
Oh, the golden age,
that time.
Fin-de-siecle. Yeah, the end of an era, right? As Debussy said, how was it again in Monsieur Croche? I forget how it went, but it was something like "Et je vous laisse le néant" or something like that. Now it's the end after Wagner. There's nowhere to go. He just carried the whole thing to a pitfall, and all of Europe was struggling, picking up the pieces. But Debussy held it together, and then everybody jumped on, or Bartok, Stravinsky, Schoenberg. Yeah. So.
Bro.
Thank you.